The suspect in an officer-involved shooting at Ingleside on the Bay has now been identified. 22-year-old Miles Tackett from Rockport has been identified as a suspect of the attempted burglary of a car and the break-in of a house. Tackett remains in custody at the hospital and is recovering. The suspect is facing charges of burglary of a vehicle, but additional charges are expected. This happened Wednesday just after midnight when, upon arrival after responding to a burglary in process, the officers confronted Tackett, who pulled out a weapon. When he did, both officers discharged their weapons, shooting the suspect. The Texas Rangers are still investigating.